Hey, welcome. It's great to see you. Thanks so much for coming. And if you're just walking in the door now, it's great to see you too. Grab a sandwich and a seat. Thanks so much for coming. So my name is V, and a really warm welcome to Big Questions today. This is a place to ask, discuss, and investigate some of those big questions we have about life, its meaning, and the claims of Jesus. So this week, we're going to be looking at the issue of suffering. So in this broken world, is it possible to believe in a good God? So soon we're going to be hearing a short talk from Richard, and after that there'll be some time for questions. We'd really love to hear your questions and have a discussion. So do text in your questions to the number on the lectern and on the pillars, and we'd really love to be able to hear what you think. It's great to have Richard Cunningham here today as our speaker. Richard is a friend of the Christian unions across the UK, so please join me in welcoming him to the front.
Thank you, V, very much. If I could just manage your expectations of this topic. If God is good, why is the world so bad? I don't have a rabbit to pull out of a hat, the ultimate answer to all this. If you were to apply for a job as a BA pilot, you would have to face some problem-solving scenarios, one of which, not so long ago, was this. You're driving around your local area in your two-seater sports car, and you come to a bus stop, and the weather is appalling. It's just absolutely lashing it down. And there are three people at the bus stop you recognize, and they're all sheltering together under a very inadequate umbrella. The first person you notice is your best friend, who's also your doctor, who saved your life not so long ago. Next to him is an old lady who looks like she's about to keel over, and she's probably going to get all sorts of pneumonia and everything else in this weather. And next to her, sheltering under the same umbrella, is a young person you would love to get to know and get romantically involved with. Who do you give the spare seat in your two-seater sports car to? That's a problem. If you want to fly with BA, here's your answer. You just pull in to the bus stop, you hand your car keys to the doctor, your best friend, help the old lady into the spare seat, and you snuggle up nice and close under the inadequate umbrella with the person you want to get to know. Then you can fly with BA. I've got no such kind of QED on this, but I do want us to really focus on the enormity of it. I mean, we don't have to look far, do we? We see something like the aftermath of Hurricane Irma, where 132 people died. And maybe we agree with Stendhal, the commentator, where he said the only excuse for God is that he doesn't exist. That's probably not a bad place to start, is it? With the two basic choices, either God exists or he doesn't. We either go for atheism or theism, belief or unbelief. Now, let's consider atheism for a moment. Here's a slightly overused quote. I do assure you, I did read the whole book, River Out of Eden, many years ago, but it is slightly overused. But it just gives us, if you like, an atheistic worldview on suffering. So here it is from Richard Dawkins, Professor Dawkins. In a universe of electrons and selfish genes, blind physical forces, and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt, other people are going to get lucky, and you won't find any rhyme or reason in it, nor any justice. The universe that we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. So in one sense, you could suggest that, looking at that quote, that atheism offers a rather neat solution to the problem of suffering. Gone are the agonizing why questions. Why did all these people die in the hurricane? Why did this child suffer? Why did my mother die so relatively young from a hospital bug? Why have I got a niece with incurable tumors? Why did my 11-year-old nephew, the son of my sister, why did he die aged 11 of brain tumors? We ask all those agonizing questions, but atheism says, nonsense question. You can't ask of a cold, chance and impersonal universe, why? If there's no God, why suffering is a nonsense question. Suffering in a godless universe is a bit like Larson's deer. Do you remember Gary Larson's cartoon of the deer standing on his hind legs, of course, hiding from a hunter behind a very thin tree? And on the left flank, where his heart is, there's what looks like a target. And his mate turns to him and says, "Bummer of a birthmark, Hal. Bummer of a birthmark." Bummer of a birthmark, the fact that you live in the path of a hurricane. Bummer of a birthmark, the fact that people in your family, the males in your family, tend to suffer with congenital heart failure in their late 50s. You see, atheism cannot allow you to ask those agonizing why questions because there's nobody there to ask the question of. Some people are going to get hurt, other people are going to get lucky. When my sister's 11-year-old son, David, died, we didn't regard him as an accident, a mere accident who didn't manage to pass on his own DNA because he wasn't fit enough, which of course he wasn't with brain tumours. No, we regarded David as deliberately brought into this world, greatly loved and sorely missed. But if reality is ultimately cold, blind, silent and pitiless, we can't think of a human being like that. So I would suggest at a very basic gut level, our intuition rages against reality being like that. Somehow our intuition tells us that this world is meant to be good and just and equitable. And when we're in trouble, when we're in real pain, we cry out to God at some point and expect him to answer us. So why do we ask those agonizing why questions if we don't actually believe in God? Why do we hanker for a paradise lost, where relationships work and the innocent don't suffer? Where does that come from? And on what is it based? Now, atheism dismisses those intuitions about who we are, how we perceive the world should be, and basically says, just accept things as they are. There's no comfort, no ultimate meaning, and no hope for things getting any better. So can I say, in all sincerity, if you are suffering, please don't let your agony and your sense of God being indifferent to you, that's how it might feel, don't let that push you towards unbelief. Paul Johnson, in his book, The Intellectuals, made a study of atheists, and a huge number of atheists actually lost a parent in childhood. So they didn't just become stoic agnostics, but they became very angry atheists, because as a child they cried out to this God, and he did nothing. So the real question is, what kind of God? Because effectively, the why suffering assumes that God is there to actually ask the question of. Thoughtful writers like C.S. Lewis and Sheldon Vanauken, of course, wrote the book A Severe Mercy about the death of his wife. They suggested that suffering brings our intuitive belief in God up to the surface, like a wake-up call. Lewis says this in his book, The Problem of Pain: God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks to us in our consciences, but shouts at us in our suffering. Suffering is God's megaphone to rouse a deaf world. But how could a good, all-powerful God let this state of affairs prevail? So as I suggested, the real question isn't does God exist, but what is God like? Do you care? Aren't you meant to be all-powerful and good? And I think we're kind of getting to the heart of it then. Do you remember the famous Stephen Fry interview on Irish TV, when he was asked by this interviewer, Byrne, who said, suppose it's all true, and you walk up to the pearly gates and are confronted by God, what will you, Stephen Fry, say to God? And what did Fry reply? I'd say bone cancer in children. What's that about? How dare you? How dare you create a world to which there is such misery that it's not our fault, it's not right, it's utterly, utterly evil. Why should I respect a capricious, mean-minded, stupid God who creates a world that is so full of injustice and pain? That's what I would say. And can I say, without wishing in the least to sound facetious, I couldn't, and nor could any other follower of Jesus, believe in a God who was capricious, mean-minded, and stupid. That is not the God we believe in. But the point is quite clear in the fact that there's meant to be an all-powerful God and a good God, and therefore there should be no suffering, but there clearly is suffering. We're still asking the question, what is he like? Remove one of his attributes of being all-powerful or being really good, and you've kind of got the answer. If he's not really all good, he might be a bit mean-spirited, as Stephen Fry suggests, and enjoy a bit of suffering. Or maybe he is really good, but he's kind of lost control. We'll explore those a bit in a moment. And that kind of does solve it. But I want us to get a Jesus view, a biblical view of God, so that we're actually arguing with the right kind of God. Now, Christians, we can tend to dumb down our answers and kind of get God off the hook by giving a view of God that makes it appear like he's got a get out. Let's consider the first one, the first view of God, that Christians call dualism, or if you like, blame it on the devil. So the devil interrupts God's really good world and causes men and women to hijack and crash planes and to blow up people in pop concerts and sports arenas. He causes sickness and earthquakes, tsunamis, and all the rest of it. And meanwhile, God is rushing around trying to put everything right. So in the dualist view, there's good and there's evil. There's a dual kind of power, good and evil. Basically, good things are from God and bad things are from the devil. On the surface, it makes sense. It's a really neat solution. God has essentially lost control, and his ultimate purposes can be thwarted, it would seem to suggest. This is what Isaiah says, a prophet in the Old Testament. I am the Lord, I create light and darkness, I bring both blessing and disaster, I the Lord do all these things. So according to the Bible, the God who is there is actually supreme and sovereign in his running of the universe. Nothing is ultimately outside his control. So Jesus does speak of a spiritual being called Satan, but he's not an equal force to God. He's a created force, and one day God will actually destroy Satan, just as a human might tread on an insect in a car park. That's, in terms of power, that would be more like the relationship of God to Satan. And interestingly, if there were a duality in the universe, then we couldn't actually even be sure, if we had hope, that God might be good and might be offering us a better life, we couldn't actually even be sure that God could deliver. Maybe his purposes would be thwarted. You see, the Christian has confidence that one day God will end the evil and injustice and violence in the world. Righteousness will cover the earth as the waters cover the sea. If you limit God's power, you can't have that confidence at all. Well, the other false move is the idea of monism, that the ultimate reality doesn't recognize good and evil, that it's just two sides of the one coin. And then if we remove the category of evil, we can't say that certain things are evil. They just kind of happen. Now, the Bible is really clear. God did not create evil, just the potential for it. And the potential to go against God and reject his love is a good thing. It's not evil. It was a good thing for the original humans to have choice, to have significance, to have responsibility for their choice. So it's not that God has a dark side. It's not like in some forms of Buddhism, where basically you do not differentiate between good and evil, pain and pleasure, male and female, that all is one and one is all, and we're all a drop in the ocean of everythingness, and the Atman becomes the Brahman. That is not the biblical view of God. Here's what the Apostle John says: God is light, in him there is no darkness at all. And it's because God goes on record of not approving of evil and suffering and violence and selfishness that we can actually be confident that one day God is going to eradicate all such things. And anyone who calls himself or herself a Christian ought to be committed to social action in this world, alleviating suffering. So what's the summary? Well, it's sort of like this. Sounds a bit whimsical. So those things which God allows to happen and those things of which he approves have to be separately defined in our minds and kept distinct. Just look at the end. That's about it. There are those things which God allows to happen and those things of which he approves. They have to be separately defined in our minds and kept distinct. And although that's difficult, it's the only way to see suffering as a real evil and not just some subjective value judgment. That there are certain things God goes on record as really hating, such as injustice, such as cruelty, such as racism, such as homophobia, and so on. The only consistent basis for morality that allows us to say categorically that Hitler's genocide was evil comes from there being a holy and a good God. So when Jesus went to the grave of a close friend, Lazarus, and wept, the translation suggests that it was like a snorting, like a war horse snorting angrily. Jesus was effectively saying, God, it's not meant to be this way. When God comes to his planet, he greatly cares because he sees death and evil as imposters coming into an otherwise good world. So God is angry in the face of suffering. He's not serene. He's not resigned to it. So, if we have to reject dualism, blame it on the devil kind of view, to be sure there's a heaven to inherit, then we've also got to reject monism to be sure there's a heaven worth inheriting. Because if God doesn't distinguish between good and evil, who wants to be part of that reality? So, if God hates human suffering so much, why doesn't he put up with it? And why do innocents suffer? So you Christians believe in an almighty God who for some mad reason allows things to go on in his universe to which he's thoroughly opposed. And that is about it. The next slide basically says this, that God somehow sees it necessary to the moral order of things to permit a certain amount of suffering in his world as a penalty for human rebellion and wickedness. Now, before you misunderstand me, before you hear me as saying, oh, so when somebody has something bad happen to them and they're suffering for something they did wrong, that's not what I'm saying. You see, there are two types of suffering. There's intrinsic suffering that's intrinsic to the action, and suffering that's imposed. So most of the suffering in the world is intrinsic to our actions, operating an economic system that doesn't pay a fair wage to developing world farmers and leaving them in near poverty, or drink driving and killing a young child on the pavement. The suffering cause is intrinsic to our actions, human action, and there are many other examples one could give of that. And then there's imposed suffering, like being sent to jail for killing people with your car. When I was a kid, I do not know why, I was about 10 at the time, I decided it would be interesting to see what it was like setting off a box of fireworks in my parents' garage and staying in there. And it was fascinating, it was terrifying, and it was all over, and I thought, wow, that was interesting. Thought nothing more of it, closed the garage door. It was a holiday, went and had my lunch. And then I heard a fire engine, and I saw some smoke, and I heard noise, and I poked my head outside to see that I'd actually set my parents' garage on fire. Now, I suffered in two ways. There was suffering that was intrinsic to my action because a lot of my toys got burnt up, and they were in the garage, including my bike. That was intrinsic to my stupid actions. But you can imagine, back in the day, my parents imposed some additional suffering on me for setting fire to their garage. And I would suggest that cause and effect accounts for the vast bulk of suffering. So intrinsic to human selfishness is the fact that 300,000 people die needlessly in Africa every week. The death toll in Haiti a few years ago from the earthquake, all the secular commentators were saying this was a man-made tragedy. These houses would not have collapsed had they been built properly with proper materials. And then there's imposed. Now, this is where it gets tricky. The Bible talks very clearly that this world is not what it once was, that yes, we've intrinsically gone our own way against him and become selfish and behave badly, but also God has cursed this world. That is, he has made our stewardship over it not as functional, not as total as it once was. So we cannot manage the world as it once. Things grow and diseases develop that we can't properly manage. Now, we've had two choices of belief or unbelief. We've rejected two false moves of limiting God's power or thinking God is perfectly fine about suffering. But it leaves us with two main objections, which is what I'm coming to via this intrinsic, extrinsic explanation. Why doesn't God stop the suffering, and why do innocents suffer? So why doesn't God stop it? When the drunk driver is about to run over the child, should God lift the child out of the way of the car, or lift the car over the child, or suddenly make that driver absolutely stone cold sober? You see, if God were to stop suffering in the world, how would he do it without violating our humanness? And that's part of our objection in the first place, isn't it? God doesn't seem to be behaving properly. But we would be puppets on a string if God intervened in that way. So maybe God does decide to remove people. Who does he remove first? Once he's removed all the really evil people, murderers, Morris dancers, Justin Bieber, once all the really terrible people are removed from this planet, where does he stop? And does he stop with you and me? Or are we essentially the good guys? You see, the only fair mechanism is a final judgment, which is coming, and God is in no hurry to bring about. But there will be justice one day, Jesus says. Very quickly, so our time is practically gone. Why do the innocent suffer? Why do the innocent suffer? There's a passage just in this gospel written by the historian and Dr. Luke. And if you want to turn to chapter 13, do so. My eyes won't let me read this print, but I'm going to put it up on the screen. So Jesus is asked the suffering question, and it's put like this. Now, there were some people present at the time who told Jesus about the Galileans whose blood Pilate has mixed with their sacrifices, a particularly brutal thing to do to pilgrims. There's this brutal Roman governor who actually hacked to death the people going to sacrifice and mixed their blood with the blood of their sufferings. The ancient mind thought, if something like that happens, you must have done something really bad. That was kind of their default setting. What does Jesus say? Do you think that these Galileans were worse sinners than all the other Galileans because they suffered this way? I tell you, no. But unless you repent, you too will all perish. It's basically saying all of us are going to die at some point. It wasn't that they were worse sinners. That wasn't why they died. There's some other explanation. Or another example, there was an event, a natural disaster effectively. Those 18, Jesus says, who died when the tower in Siloam fell on them, do you think they were more guilty than all the others living in Jerusalem? I tell you, no. But unless you repent, you too will all perish. Now we might say, why can't God organize it so that calamity always hits people in precise proportion to their sins? And that's not possible because we are human, because we are social creatures who possess a genetic solidarity, which means that one person's actions potentially affect everyone. That the first human's actions have a consequence for all of us. Just as diseases are brought into the world, just as terrible chemicals can blight crops for many, many generations, so our actions affect everyone. I once taught a boy who was found guilty of mugging an old lady. Now, when did that old lady's suffering start? Certainly when he banged on her door and beat her up. But if we looked into this boy's history, basically he'd been abused by a succession of men. And in this family, like many East End families, there'd been no male figure, stable male figure in the family since the Great War when so many London men were killed. So even the pride and the aggression that precipitated the Great War, somehow that was linked to that old lady's suffering. That's just the nature of our genetic solidarity. So because we share a common sinfulness, we also share a common suffering. So let me quickly come to an end, because you've got lectures skating, we've got questions to ask. We've got two choices. Either we say a distortion has occurred in God's world, that this really isn't the way it's meant to be, which corresponds to our intuition, or reality is chaotic and meaningless. That's basically the choice. A distortion has occurred, and that's the Christian view, into an otherwise good world, or that reality is chaotic and meaningless, and that's the atheistic view. Now, what the Bible does for us when we come face to face with God on his planet, he doesn't give us a QED answer to suffering, but actually he gives us a greater mystery. He actually gives us a man on a cross dying. And we ask the question, when Jesus died, did God lose control? Was God just and good in allowing Jesus to die on a cross? Why did an innocent man, Jesus, have to suffer? And why didn't God stop his suffering? Well, those are important questions. And the Bible says Jesus suffered in two ways. Intrinsic, of course, intrinsic suffering was the fact that men were jealous, men envied him, they wanted him dead. Now, so we understand the crucifixion. But the real agony of Jesus' death on the cross was in those dark hours when God decided he was going to deal with evil and suffering once and for all, and that the rebellion, the fracture we had caused in the universe, I say we, humans collectively, we share that genetic solidarity with the first humans. God justly wanted to go on record saying, that is not on. That a price has to be paid. There's so much suffering in my world. Sin needs to be seen to be serious, and Jesus is willing to take the price for that. So God imposed on Jesus the penalty that was due our sin, that somehow in those agonizing hours, Jesus suffered in a way that we deserve to suffer, to show that sin was serious and yet could be forgiven. So back to our choices as we finish. We have a choice between unbelief or belief. And we either say that suffering is just the way the universe is, or that it's an intruder. It's not how the world was meant to be. But if God really has come as a man, and he really has suffered on our behalf and defeated death by rising again from the dead, then as Sam Gamgee says to Gandalf when he comes alive, does it mean that everything sad is going to come untrue? Then it does mean that everything sad is going to come untrue, that there is a hope. There's hope and strength in our suffering now. There's a God who is there, who loves us, but who ushers us through this life and into a life of the world to come. That's the basic choice. And the answer is not found in philosophy. It's not found in, all sorts of detailed theological descriptions of suffering, but it's found in a man coming to this earth and dying on a cross. Would you just take a minute to just quickly chat to your neighbour to think, okay, he said a lot, he spoke rather quickly. I know I don't agree with all of it. I know I've got some questions. What are they? So why don't you work out what those questions are? And it might be you want to start writing them down. It may be you want to start texting them. So do that for a minute, and then I'll try and answer your questions. Sorry I've gone on a bit longer than I intended. We will finish in plenty of time for you to get to lectures, so don't worry about that. And if you need to go, just go anyway.
Great. Sorry to not give you very long to chat, but we do want to get on to questions so that you can get back to lectures if you do have lectures. So we're going to start our time of Q&A now. So I've had a question texted in already. There will be a mic going round as well. So if you want to ask a question from the floor, just stick up a hand and Stephen will come and bring you the mic. So does anyone want to kick us off from the floor? Great. Stephen? Oh, actually, Kira. Great. Just give him a so we can get the mic so everyone can hear. Fab. Okay. It's not quite on. Do you want to turn it on? Thanks.
Hi. I just wondered, how does what you're talking at the end, because you're mainly talking at the end about suffering imposed by humans acting, but what about sort of the Stephen Fry question of bone cancer, or something that you think that that God would want to go away and God would have the power to fix, it wouldn't adversely affect, human free will or justice for people doing bad things. So essentially, why doesn't God fix that, given he has the power to do so?
Yeah, thank you very much. That's a really good question. I think that is the one we find the hardest, isn't it, when it's young children who seem to be, I mean, they clearly are innocent. I mean, you know, it's a young child with bone cancer, and it's a terrible thing to die of. I think the first thing to say is the Bible is unequivocal. I mean, a number of places, there's a whole book called Job that explores whether Job's suffering is because he's done lots of things wrong. The answer is no. But if you could peel back, you know, the mysteries of the spiritual kingdom, you'd see there's stuff going on that you couldn't ever know. So this may sound like a bit of a get-out. So certainly one of the answers is God does have reasons and purposes that we don't know about. I'm going to give you more than that, but that's there. But unequivocally, it's not because of Job's sin. Similarly, in the Gospel of John, chapter 9, there's a man born blind, and Jesus' disciples say, is it because of his sin or his parents? And Jesus says, neither. So, I mean, I know this isn't your question, but it's worth just stating clearly, God is not punishing that child for their sin or their parents' sin as such. But we are in a world that's fractured. It's not the world it should be. So the moment human beings go against God and their stewardship of the world becomes so much lessened, all sorts of things intrude. And amongst that is, of course, disease and sickness and all the rest of it. And I don't quite know genetically how those things get passed on, but it is a fractured world. It's not the atheistic view, that's just the way things are. Get used to it, get used to bone cancer in young children. But because I think we know it shouldn't be like that, that's why we struggle. And the reality is, yes, we live in that fractured world now, and it is terribly painful, and I do not know why God doesn't end the world sooner than he does, but all I do know is that when he does, the time of mercy, the megaphone time to rouse us from our stupor ends, and it's justice for all of us. And whilst I want to see that suffering end, and of course, you know, many people are committed to trying to end that suffering through medicine and care and everything else, at the same time, we also want, as a Christian, want a time of justice and mercy to be extended. So I would suggest that suffering in children is, if you like, part of that fractured world. It's not that God's doing things, he's not inflicting people with things, it's just part of a fractured reality. Yeah.
God, thanks. But couldn't God, it'd be sort of easy to imagine that if God is omnipotent and doesn't have to, obey his own laws of physics and stuff,
Yeah.
couldn't God say, fix cancer, fix disease for the meantime, and then still have a judgment a long way away? Do you see my point?
Yeah.
It's sort of it only seems capricious for God to not act when people are suffering.
Yeah. But I suppose the question is this. I mean, God is not our servant. It's not, God, I want you to fix that. Oh, so what do we ask him to fix? And where do we want him to stop? And on what terms are we actually saying, God, make all this right? C.S. Lewis says something very provocative that suffering is God's roadblock to hell. We could easily find ourselves in a fool's paradise and think, well, the toast always lands butter side up. Oh, nothing ever goes wrong in my life. Oh, this is fine. I'm all hunky-dory. But if we are in a provisional reality where actually we do have to face the consequences for our rebellion against God, there is a sense in which, as Van Orkin says, sometimes suffering, I'm not saying this for all people, I'm not saying that my sister's 11-year-old son dying so horribly was a severe mercy. I wouldn't dream of saying it in individual cases. But there is the suggestion that the actual presence of suffering, if it actually wakes us up to the fact that we're meant to be in a relationship with God, that there is an eternity to be enjoyed, it could be a severe mercy. But I think even if we can't understand God's hand, why doesn't he stop more suffering than he does? And he uses agency, he uses Christians, he uses mission. There's a whole story of Christian mission and hospice work and everything else. It's a big story. Jesus was the first great physician. But the reality is that God, even if we don't understand his hand, we can trust his heart, because when he visits his planet in the form of Jesus, he's a God who cares, who weeps at a funeral, who does the good he can do. But he doesn't heal everyone. And I'm sure many people said, Jesus, why didn't you heal my child? Why did you only heal those people? Because in a broken, fallen world, we've got to accept the consequences of our brokenness. I know I just feel the inadequacy of my answer, but sorry, time's short and it has to be soundbite-ish, but happy to chat afterwards.
And yeah, I'm really sorry we didn't get on to any more questions. That really is
That's
all
my
we've
fault.
got time for. No,
I
don't
do
worry. Thank you
apologise.
so much, Richard, though.
Okay.
Great. And that really wasn't enough time, and there are lots more questions. I had questions texted in, and Richard will be around afterwards. So do stay on and chat to him. There will be snacks coming out to you at your tables. So do carry on the conversations you had earlier as well. That would be great.
It just occurs to me, I know nothing here, tell me to get back in my box, but if there are some people who don't have lectures, who want to stay for an extra 10 minutes, I'm happy to do public Q&A. Anybody want that? Is that allowed?
Yeah, no, I think it might be easier if you want to if you have a maybe smaller group around, people who want to chat
Don't
more.
mind.
Would that be, let's go with that, just so that we can let people chat in groups as well if they want. Brilliant. And we'd love to hear how you found the event on a more, on the feedback cards, on the tables, and if you'd like to chat more about this or other issues, please just tick the I'm interested box and someone from the Christian Union will get in touch. So there's more resources to think about this question on the table at the back, so they're free for you to take away. So this little book, How Can God Allow Suffering? And another looking at what kind of hope. Richard touched on it at the end, looking at the hope that we have in Jesus in the face of suffering. So please make the most of those. And if you want to discuss this sort of issue more, there's some discussion groups happening in colleges looking at the issue of justice. So how can we have justice in the face of suffering? So have a look at the details there. There will be specific details about what's happening in your college. So check that out. It'd be great to see you there next week. I think that's it from me. We're here again next week looking at the question of the historicity of the Gospels. So can we trust those Gospel accounts of Jesus' life? So it'd be great to see you there. Have a great week.